las golondrinas, porque me voy lejos, muy lejos. Hace tiempo lo que más quiero se fue muy lejos, se fue de aquí. Que me toquen las golondrinas, que sus notas lleguen a mi alma, a esa tierra linda y lejana que me ha robado a mi querer. Por amor de Dios les pido, buen amigo cantinero, para las otras yo coopero, ya no me hagas esperar. Tóquenme las golondrinas, porque pienso alejarme. Solo quiero que recuerden mis tristezas y mi dolor. Cariño mío, corazón de otra. ¡Ajá!
Y tú que de blanca rosa, sí señor.
Adiós, adiós, adiós. Que me toquen las golondrinas, porque me voy lejos, muy lejos. Hace tiempo lo que más quiero se fue muy lejos, se fue de aquí. Que me toquen las golondrinas, que sus notas lleguen a mi alma, a esa tierra linda y lejana que me ha robado a mi querer. Por amor de Dios les pido, buen amigo cantinero, para las otras yo coopero, ya no me hagas esperar. Tóquenme Solo quiero que recuerden mis tristezas y mi dolor. Cariño mío, corazón de otra. ¡Ajá!
Y tupe de blanca rosa, sí señor.
Adiós, adiós, adiós.
Hello and welcome. Bienvenido a nuestra plática. We have a wonderful panel discussion today about the proposed demolition of the Alazán Courts. Those courts were built in 1939 with the support of the local community and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. In the words of Franklin Roosevelt, the hopes of the Republic cannot forever tolerate either undeserved poverty or self-serving wealth. This is what the residents of the Alazans now face. Undeserved poverty while they toil away at low-paying yet essential jobs, and the self-serving wealth of developers in the real estate industry. When the first families moved in, it was a step up. For many, the first time to have a private bathroom. It was hope for this community. I would like to introduce myself first. My name is Kayla Miranda, and I'm an Alazán Apache resident. I'm a mom of 4. I'm a housing justice organizer. My home is here. I don't want to move. I don't want to lose my community, my friends, my family, the life that I've built here. It is so important to preserve and protect the low-income individuals because we need that help. Next, I would like to introduce Robert Winterode.
Thank you, Kayla. Good morning, everyone. I am a past resident of Victoria Courts and Alazán Courts. I am a proud Lanier Voc. I'm a graduate of Duke University and Cornell Law School, and I'm currently an education attorney for Disability Rights Texas. And I'm glad to be here.
Next, we have Teri Castillo.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Kayla. I'm Teri Castillo. I'm an active member of the Historic West Side Residents Association. We are an association who organizes around community and housing justice. And my family lived in the Alazán Courts in the late 80s, providing my family upward mobility.
John Washington.
Yes, hi. My name is John Washington. I'm with People's Action at the Homes Guarantee Campaign, a national housing organizer working to not only save public housing, but actually to build 20 million new units of public housing and to convert all current existing housing into green social housing to create jobs for people in public housing and to preserve our ability to live on this planet. I'm really honored to be on this panel and to share space with you all, and definitely want to, lend solidarity to the fight you have and to the fights across the country to save public housing and to keep that upward mobility Terry was just talking about.
Miss Christine Drennon.
Thanks, Kayla. My name is Christine Drennon. I teach and direct the Urban Studies program at Trinity University. And my contribution here is really kind of a larger scope as far as the fate of public housing in the United States and about the misfit between what's happening with public housing and what's happening with wages. So my perspective is not really on the ground like others, but I hope to complement them. Thanks, Kayla.
And Antonia Castañeda.
Buenos dias. Thank you, Kayla, and thank you, everybody. I'm so pleased to be here. My name is Antonia Castañeda. I'm an historian, and today I'm here as a member of the West Side Preservation Alliance. We advocate for preservation justice, for the preservation of working class history, culture, and structures, and certainly public housing, meaning, of course, today, the Alazán Apache courts. Thank you.
So we have a wonderful panel for you guys today. I would like to start out by thanking Esperanza Peace and Justice Center for hosting this event for us, and also our co-sponsors, the Historic West Side Resident Association, the Coalition for Tenants Justice, and Texas Housers. So we would like to give the panelists an opportunity to answer a few questions that we have, and then we'll open up the floor to Q&A. You can post your comments and questions in the chat. I will ask that everyone respectful. This is an open conversation and all are. Is it important and protect the historic Alazán Apache core community members who live there, or why is it important? Teri.
There's a slight lag, but I believe the question was, why is it important to preserve and protect the historic Alazán Courts? When we look at cities that have demolished their public housing structures, we see that they affect the surrounding neighborhoods and communities in a multitude of ways, right? One, not only are communities and families being displaced from public housing and being removed from their social network and community, they're being placed further away from their places of work. Many folks rely on public transportation, and VIA doesn't necessarily reach that far. So it's important that we recognize, right, by displacing folks from their housing that's accessible to all their networks, work and family community, we're making their lives that much more harder. It's going to cost more to commute to and from work. And we're also losing that public housing stock. Once it's demolished, we will not get that housing back. And we already know that for every 100 families who earn 30% of the average area median income, San Antonio only has 38 affordable units. So demolishing public housing would make that availability much smaller. And we need to ensure that we stabilize our neighborhoods and we preserve that affordable housing stock, because what we're seeing is an increased poverty rate in San Antonio. So why are we demolishing the housing that houses our most cost burden?
Thank you, Teri. Robert.
Thank you, Kayla. So this was home to me, you know, and I think unless you've gone through it, I think it's hard to understand what exactly that means, because it sounds so simple. I think a lot of people, you know, are used to having homes. But my mom and I, we came to San Antonio in 1998. And the 14 years before, I lived in some variety of homelessness. You know, I've lived in homeless shelters in Miami, St. Petersburg, Atlanta, Phoenix, Denver, and then finally here in San Antonio. And one of the reasons for that is that none of those cities at the time were offering safe public housing to my family. There are wait lists across the board because this issue, as will be spoken about later on in our discussion, is an issue that's a problem throughout our nation. But you know, when I got to San Antonio, I arrived at the old SAM homeless shelter, which is a building that was across from UTSA downtown. It's no longer there. But before that, you know, I lived in conditions that no child should ever have to live in. I've lived in a tent city. I've lived in a trailer with a hole in the wall. I've lived in a slum apartment, you know, that had a rat infestation, and the rats ate my pet parrots. And they weren't like large parrots. They were like the you know, kind of medium-sized green and gray parrots. And then, you know, I attended about 30 different elementary schools. Like it is a miracle that I was able to like actually get some learning in between. And I really do credit that to my mom, who, you know, has always been hardworking and just really nurturing of my academics. So when I got here, I was placed at Victoria Courts, which for y'all who don't know, it used to be across from Hemisphere. And for the first time, I had found stability. I had found safe, affordable, well-kept housing. And then the housing authority some months later said, you know, these projects are too old. You know, the condition is bad, which was not true, at least for my unit and the units of my neighbors. We're going to tear them down. So they moved us after that to Alazán, where I lived over 3 years. On Alazán, I will tell you, like I've been a renter for a long time. One of the best, most maintenance-free housing complexes I've ever lived in. Like, you know, I've had a lot more problems with private landlords, and I don't, you know, obviously I don't live in slum housing anymore, but, you know, SAHA, at least at the time, was doing a really amazing job with their housing program. It seems things have changed since then. But, you know, my biggest issue now is, you know, just kind of thinking about, you know, a homeless child coming to San Antonio or living in San Antonio. They don't have that option today to go to public housing. The wait list for public housing at SAHA is years and years long currently. They just keep cutting housing units, and they've done that for the last 20 years, if not longer. So, you know, I ask y'all, I ask especially the city leaders and the SAHA executives, where are these homeless families supposed to go now? Where are people with disabilities supposed to go? Where do you want the poor to live? You know, if you're not going to provide safe, affordable housing for them, what are they supposed to do? We know San Antonio has a very large poverty population, and yet there is not enough affordable housing. I think we all can agree in the city to provide for that population. And so, you know, we are headed, especially in this pandemic, for a housing crisis. And, you know, Alazán is a treasure for that community and such a resource for those people there, and a community in and of itself.
Robert, I agree more. They're consistently and continuously removing public housing units, which is permanent affordable housing, and they are replacing them with these mid-income properties. Majority, 60% AMI or above, and that's middle income. Comes wealthy, 30% and below, which is affordable to the public housing here in Alazán, are just shrinking in number. So how are they supposed to run people wait list if they're consistently removing housing units and replacing them with these market rents, or, you know, that are not even affordable to the people on the wait list? I would like to pass to Christine.
This mute button, I always forget. But thank you, Kayla. And again, from a little bit from a more distanced perspective, yes, the San Antonio Housing Authority, which I've worked closely with the Housing Authority for a long time, and have some very fond relationships, but they also work within the federal environment, and it's at the federal level that policy changes really since the 1990s have driven the loss of public housing. Just this shift, and it was a shift in thinking that was really tied to social science at the time, that said that families that are living in what they called isolated poverty were not socially mobile. And that research that actually was coming out of some of the leading universities in the country then drove the Clinton administration policy to really change their thinking about public housing and to shift from the construction of public housing that we're now demolishing towards mixed income communities. That was, we know that as the Hope 6 project, that then became the Choice Neighborhood Project under the Obama administration. But further work has shown that that model is flawed, and that mixed income, just living in a mixed income community does not guarantee or does not necessarily even promote social mobility. And instead, so what we've got is a situation now where we've kind of chased a model for nearly almost 30 years. Now with some data from around the country, realizing that, well, this is not promising some of the results that we had originally hoped. So some of the science behind it was flawed. And so local housing authorities are kind of stuck in this. They're stuck in this environment. But where I do hope and urge our housing authority is kind of following on what Robert had said, is that, wow, you know, we were doing a really good job at one point. These were really, really good and safe and healthy communities. And yes, it's kind of fundamental housing, you know, it's not luxurious, but it's community and it's stable and it's dependable. And my hope is that in this less than desirable national kind of environment for housing, can't we at a very local level be a little bit more creative and really be a little bit more resourceful, and really continue to push for housing for those families who need it the most, especially given the economy of San Antonio that's so dependent on service workers, and our wages are just abysmally low. So that's kind of, let me pass it to someone else to kind of fill that kind of grand policy kind of picture with human faces. But I would love to pick up this idea again as we go along.
Antonia?
Hello, yes. With respect to the question of why it's important to preserve and protect Alazán, let me talk, picking up on also Robert's very important and personal story. Sorry, I wound up, got caught up with the chat. So I grew up in labor camps from a farm working family. And those were sometimes tents, sometimes chicken coops, sometimes disused army barracks. So the issue of housing matters to me personally a great deal. And as a member of the West Side Preservation Alliance, who is seeking to preserve the housing, we're seeking to preserve the community, to repeat and pick up on what others have said, and the importance of that community. And most specifically, public housing, and in particular, the Alazán Apache courts, those courts, we're seeking to preserve working class history, culture, traditions, creativity, genius, because public housing allows those possibilities to grow and thrive, as Robert again stated. And so with respect to the WPA, the West Side Preservation Alliance, we are concerned that the courts that opened in 1941-42 are the oldest existing public housing development in San Antonio. And so they represent a period of architecture, a period of history that has been further extended and expanded. They represent then historical legacy of public housing and the critical belief, folks, that housing is a human right. So thank you. Let me pass it on to somebody else.
And John, would you like?
I think I heard you say my name. First off, I just think we're having the wrong conversation here, and I hope I don't offend anybody with my comments. But if you watch what happened last week, we are at war, right? There is a war, a race war in America between Black and brown folks, between the poor and between the rich. And every part of American history is a reflection of this war. And I'm sorry, but academics and social scientists and bureaucrats are here to make us think that this is about answers, numbers, about rules. But the reality is all of those are tactics that are designed to get us to not fight to win and fight for our lives. Gentrification is the evolution of settler colonialism. And there are developers and profiteers who want to use this land to make money, right? And they don't care where you're going to live. They don't care about disabled people. They don't care about homeless people. They don't care about anybody or anything but money. And if we fight them with numbers and their logic, we will not win. The people who have lived in this community since it was built specifically because of residential segregation, because they wanted Mexican workers without Mexican bodies having access to the rest of the community. They put this place here intentionally. There is a legacy and a history of the intentional land use and urban development around residential segregation. And while gentrification moves people around, it moves those people around in their class and in their same race blocks. These people do not care about us. They do not want us to live in their communities, and they see billions of dollars on the land that people now live on. And they will do anything that they can to get it out of the hands of the people. So I see this as a struggle for our humanity, as a struggle for our rights to existence as human beings, not as an intellectual exercise, not as meetings with public housing authorities, but as a moral fight for who has the right to space. And this is a fight that my people, that all of our peoples have been in for the history of this country and colonialism, that when the rich and wealthy decide that they can better use our land than we can, they get to do that. So I want to speak in terms of power, right? We are not going to convince them to not make billions of dollars off of this land. We have to bring together the collective power of the people who have lived there, the people who currently live there, the people who understand what it means to be homeless, to not know where you're going to sleep the next night, to not know how you're going to eat, to look at your parents and never understand how they make it work, but always know that they are going to make it work. There is so much power in us and in our connection to place and space, because this isn't about housing. Housing is social infrastructure, right? Our housing systems define everything about space, and those who want to make money want to redefine it for themselves. That is what gentrification is. It is the reorientation of space toward the gentry, which simply means the landowners, right? The people who benefit from owning land, the people who collect rents. And what we're seeing across the country and what we're seeing here is a movement that is justified by studies. But the reality is the root cause of it is privatization. And the RAD program, rental assistance demonstration, Section 9, they're all different tactics to offer public money for private processes and private benefits. And that is what fascism is. Right? This is fascism, and there is no separation between what we're seeing here and what we saw at the US Capitol last week. It is fascism. It is the orientation of everything in our society towards benefiting rich, wealthy white men. And we have to stop it, and we have to be aggressive in stopping it. So why it's important is because public housing provides cultural stability, it provides individual stability, it provides neighborhood stability. And if you hear any elder talk about how public housing looked in the 60s and 70s, they will talk about, you know, the community that was built there. They will talk about the events that people brought together. They will talk about public housing at its height, redefining the ability of people of color to exist in this country. And the people at the highest levels of power in this country know that the ability of people of color to survive in this country is dependent on their access to housing. Their ability to be stable in their employment is dependent on their access to housing, and they will always try to undermine our access to housing because it makes us weak. It makes us unable to fight. It makes us unable to come together. And gentrification is as much about destabilizing communities, about breaking apart social networks that don't allow us to build power, as it is about making money. And so when they destroy public housing, they're destroying the foundation of people of color and poor people's ability to exist in America. And that's the goal, right? That is the ultimate goal of the white supremacist agenda and the right-wing agenda in this country. The sad thing is our left-wing agenda, our center left, because in any other country it wouldn't be left agenda, is that corporations know how to do everything better than the government does. And this is neoliberalism, and it's under supported by this idea that the average person doesn't know how to manage their own housing, and the idea that government bureaucrats better understand what to do with our housing and our land than anyone else does. And the reality is we know our neighborhoods, we know our people, we know what they need, and we should be in control of the resources that create public housing and that maintain public housing. And we need to take that out of the hands of the bureaucrats, because they can be convinced that we don't know what we're talking about, and that the fact that poor people live around people of other incomes is magically going to make them better people and better educated and improve all these outcomes. It's an absurd, absolutely absurd argument, right? It's gaslighting. The reality is they want to use mixed income to push poor people out and to lose that opportunity. And I want people to be crystal clear about something. Housing is about supply and demand. The government's actions around housing are all about manipulating demand, right? So if there was full housing for everyone, rents wouldn't go up because people would have other options. They need homelessness to drive up rents, just like they need unemployment to drive down labor costs. And as people around the country who are struggling with these issues of the transition from the divestment stage of gentrification, where cities and communities completely withhold all resources until neighborhoods like this bottom out, to the investment stage where public taxes, public lands, all public resources are offered to big companies to gentrify neighborhoods. We all have to understand that everywhere in the country is going through some stage of this, and we have to start coming together and saying there's a new agenda here that not only requires to the existing public housing, but requires an increase in the production of public housing. Because public housing originally was built to house workers when the private market was not able to meet the demand. And now that the private market is able to meet the demand of the luxury market, but it's not meeting our market, the people that really need it, we have to push the government to do what it's done for big corporations, to do in our interests. And I'm deeply interested in working with all of the people who stand to save this project, to do that, but to do that with an attitude and with a clarity that will actually win. And we've seen this across the country. We've seen it in New York City. We've seen it in other cities where public housing has been demolished as a whole, but there have been winning campaigns to save particular projects in particular buildings. And I think we need to look at the history and legacy of the resistance of public housing residents, of how effective organizing in public housing has been in particular moments, and learn from those lessons and build power to create a crisis of moral conscience around this issue. This is not an academic issue. This is not about the numbers, the replacement, who's there. This is about our right to space, our right to the city, as David Harvey would put it. And I'm excited that this meeting is coming together and all of these folks are here because it shows that people care, and everyone here and everyone on Facebook represents a large network of people that we can employ to push back against this agenda to shut down public housing in San Antonio. And I just want to make sure that folks are coming at the issue with the level of intensity that our opposition is, if that makes sense. And I know that victory is possible because I've been a part of public housing victories. And our goal right now is to build a homes guarantee, is to have social housing, what they have in the civilized world, where everyone is guaranteed a place to live. If it can happen in Europe, it can happen in America, it can happen in the richest country in the history of the world. And the last point I want to make, Donald Trump is no longer our president, but Donald Trump built an entire empire out of gentrification. People focused on who he was when it came to immigration and other things, but he was a gentrifier in chief, and his HUD agenda was to destroy public. Literally, they wrote that we want all of these units gone in the next 10 years. We have to push the Biden administration, not just to undo that, but to go further and to invest in public housing, to repeal the Faircloth Amendment, and to rebuild our communities. And sorry, I'm getting ranty, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, John. That was wonderful. Our next question is, are there any myths or misconceptions about living in public housing that you would like to address? How are these misconceptions a barrier to residents of public housing being able to organize and advocate for their rights? Robert, I'd like you to go first, please.
Thank you. So I'm going to address a few different ones. The first one, and I think you hear this a lot, public housing tenants are lazy and they take advantage of the system. And that is such an objectionable idea, but it is perpetuated by our system, as John noted. And, you know, I'll tell you, like, my family moved from city to city, from home to home, because of job and housing insecurity caused by my mom's disability. She has no criminal record. She's not a drug addict. She just is a mentally ill person, you know? And, you know, I was a type of poverty who is one move away, one bad life situation away from changing my entire life. I saw it happen in my high school at Lanier. You know, some beautiful futures were wrecked because of the system's inequities, because they did not get the assistance they needed. And, you know, it's still personal to me. My mom now, she is 76 years old. She has a severe mental illness. It's still going, right? She has stage 4 breast cancer. She gets a total of about $800 a month in disability and retirement benefits from Social Security. She gets those retirement benefits because she worked her entire life, you know, but she just could never escape the poverty line because of her disability. And so when I lived in Austin, I tried finding her affordable housing there. Wasn't able to, because every single housing complex had years and years of waiting lists, much like here in San Antonio. Some of them were 7, 8 years long. I don't know who, you know, can actually, you know, wait that long for a place to live. But it speaks to that national crisis. And then when she moved to San Antonio, tried finding affordable housing here. Again, every single complex in San Antonio had a long waiting list. And thankfully, she has found subsidized housing now, but that's after more than a year, and only because the COVID pandemic has ravaged the senior housing complex where she lives now. And so it's not because our system is, you know, equitable or generous. It's because, you know, it's for the very opposite reason. And for a while, she was paying $650 a month in rent. She could barely pay her utilities. She had a point where she was thinking about living in a homeless shelter in Austin, and thankfully we were able to avert all of that. But no senior citizen her age or even younger should have to face those choices. No person with a disability should have to face those choices. One of the other misconceptions we hear, they are telling all of these residents, all 501 residents, or families actually, because there's more than that, that's the number of units, that they're going to get a Section 8 voucher, and it's this golden ticket. SAHA is telling these residents, they can move wherever they want in the city with this voucher, and that's just not true. There's not that many Section 8 rentals available to begin with. And, you're not going to find many, if any, in places like, Stone Oak or Southtown. You're not going to find it in the safest areas of town. These residents are going to be relocated, if they can relocate, to a Section 8 household in another poor, potentially more crime-ridden part of town. And one of the other things, so in a previous life, I did a lot of work defending tenants from evictions. And so public housing, what they also won't tell you, it's a constitutional right. These tenants have a right to their housing, to living there. No other form of subsidized housing has the same right, including Section 8 vouchers. And Section 8 vouchers, while it is a wonderful program, are not as good. And I saw many tenants being evicted. I saw their vouchers being broken because when they fought their landlord evicted them. They retaliated, evicted them for some minor thing, and then they were out of the program. And if they're either banned from the program, or if they want to reapply, it will take them years, because Section 8 also has a very long waiting list because we don't have enough affordable housing. What SAHA won't tell you, they recently demolished Wheatley Courts in 2014. More than half of those tenants are no longer being serviced by SAHA. They're out of the public housing program. They're out of the Section 8 program. Where did they go? SAHA is not going to disclose that, right? I mean, obviously, most of them probably are still struggling, especially in the midst of a pandemic. And that's the other myth. They're going to tell you public housing is not necessary. So, we've talked some about this, but these projects were erected as a result of the tuberculosis pandemic in the 30s and 40s. And because there was so much substandard housing that it was actually making that pandemic worse, right? And so they wanted to give, the poor people in San Antonio a safe, dependable place to live. And then the tuberculosis numbers went down. Now in the middle of a new pandemic, this housing authority, the city of San Antonio, they are wanting to reduce 501 units. That choice is unconscionable. And I don't know, sometimes how city officials and housing officials, can sleep at night. They are condemning families, and they're condemning persons with disabilities to a very bleak and dangerous future.
Thank you, Robert. I think I'll answer some of these questions as well. The myths and misconceptions. Robert covered some of them, but another one is, shaming women for raising their children or for having their children. Again, the people in public housing are not lazy. They are the most hardworking people that you will ever meet. Life happens. Sometimes you go through stuff and you need a little help. It doesn't mean that you're trying to abuse the system. It doesn't mean that you're looking for a handout. It doesn't mean you're being irresponsible. Life happens. Myself, I owned a business. I owned a home. I was able to afford my children when I had them. And my youngest child, his biological parents both went to prison, and I took him in. So I didn't even give birth to that one. A series of unfortunate events in my life caused me to lose everything, and I ended up homeless, and I needed help to get back on my feet. Does that make me a bad person? Does it make me someone who's abusing the system? No, it doesn't. It just means that I needed a little help. And that's what the majority of the families here are going through. They're not uneducated. Yes, there are some tenants that didn't finish school or didn't get any type of formal education or didn't get any type of job training, but they're young and they still need that help. And there are programs to help them. I'm very educated. I graduated from high school a year early. I am working on a bachelor's degree. I have not completed it, but I am. And I've had a lot of real world work experience. So to tell me that I need job training, that's an insult. What I need is a little understanding. What I need is a little compassion. So the next time you hear public housing, don't automatically assume it's just a bunch of people laying around, not working, popping out kids, and just being a burden on society. Another misconception is it's your tax dollars going to it. The people in public housing or Section 8 or any other type of housing system do not stop paying taxes. They pay their taxes just like you do. So it doesn't mean that your taxes are going to pay for their lives. Their own taxes are paying for it. One of the barriers to public housing residents organizing is fear. There is a huge fear of retaliation, and it's very real. I have entire lists of residents at the Alazans who do not want the demolition, who want to stay in a safe environment. They want the renovations. They want them to be fixed. They want the crime to be addressed. But that does not mean that the houses have to, the apartments have to be torn down. It doesn't mean that the housing has to be lost. It's not either or. And that is the message that is getting out through SAHA is this is a done deal. It's already done. It's not. They're barely sending in the application for HUD. They haven't even started yet. It is not a done deal. And it is not either or. If you get a group of people together and you tell them, okay, we can give you these brand new apartments, or you can stay in the conditions you're living in. What choice do you think that they're going to take? Do you think they're going to say, okay, we'll just leave us the way that we are? Of course not. They're going to say, okay, well, that's our two choices, then we're going to take the demolition. But if you give them the choice of renovation, you give them the choice of better living in the apartments that are there, not all of them are going to say demolition. They're going to say, oh, well, if you can fix this, then I'm good where I'm at. Because there's a community here. You're friends with your neighbors. You count on each other. You're there for each other. And it's a social system built within the housing. So to lose that system is harsh, and it's hard. And it just makes things more difficult. So did anyone else want to answer this question? John, I see you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say that the narratives about public housing residents and really all benefits recipients, I think are really born out of they're just born out of racism, white supremacy, and patriarchy, right? And again, this idea that we are not, according to the folks in the business world, and some of them may have black and brown faces, maybe women, but the reality is they're benefiting and operating the system of white supremacy, need to build these narratives, because if they don't, people would actually look at the material conditions and the people. And this is why it's so important for public housing residents to tell their own stories and to get in the media as much as possible. Think about this: developers, corporations, they get in the media as much as they tell their story all day, every day. They budget for it. They make extra billions of dollars just so they can constantly lie to you so much that you believe it. And I think that we need to be ruthless about getting our stories out there as much as possible. That's why events like this are so important, because the reality is the biggest welfare queens on earth are developers. They get insane tax breaks. I just Googled the San Antonio Economic Development whatever, something with a C, company, corporation. They're giving out $20 million bonds for every building that's built. right? Who's the bigger welfare queen? Whose iPhone in the supermarket line should I be worried about? A billionaire developer who already has billions of dollars, millions of dollars of assets in networks of LLCs that none of us could ever touch. And these people still are given billions of dollars in tax breaks. And when you look at that over time, like, are low-income homeowners getting property tax breaks, or are they getting pushed out of their neighborhoods because their property values are rising, but they don't want to sell? So the real welfare queens are people like Donald Trump and the developer class that entirely benefit. Even HUD spends more money subsidizing mortgages than it does on public housing. I'm going to say that again. HUD spends more money subsidizing mortgages than it does on public housing. Those mortgages, most people would go through without HUD subsidy, right? Because you need to have good credit to get a mortgage. So again, like, the lack of knowledge and understanding of how the wealthy benefit from these systems too, the ease that they do it. They don't have to fill out the same applications that we do. Promise you, you go on the City of San Antonio website, you go on the San Antonio Economic Development Company's website, and you look at those applications, they're one-page applications. You fill out a food stamp application, you need a social worker to walk you through it, even if you do speak English, and then you have to recertify every 6 months. That means I was one time working debt collections, I got a $4 raise, and I lost $2,000 worth of benefits, right? So now guess what? I thought I was coming up, now I'm broke again. Do these people, they get 30, 40-year tax abatements. Think about that. Think about that. They get the right to pay taxes on the original price of a building before they develop it to a $100 million building. There are people with $100 million buildings paying taxes on $50,000 worth of land. It is absolutely insane to me. And we need to start pointing the finger back at these people who are saying we're lazy, when we know they're lazy. They're sitting up in an office sexually harassing all the women in their office. They're sitting up in the office trying to figure out how not to pay contractors on their projects so we don't live in quality housing. These are the laziest, most entitled and disrespectful people on earth. And they dare tell struggling single mothers that they have a problem because they get a couple $100 a month for food, when these people are literally, look at the federal budget, getting billions of dollars to make themselves richer. So one of my biggest problems is that we don't know these things, and then we internalize our oppression. We hear the noise. We hear all of these narratives so much that they actually get embedded in us, and we question our own dignity. And that is ultimately what racism, patriarchy, and colonialism is about to get us to question our own dignity, while our work and our existence is actually what props up all of their systems. So y'all are absolutely right about the stigma, but I think that we need to put that stigma back on the same people that are making these decisions about where we get to live.
Thank you, John. I'm going to go on and move on to the next question. What is the relationship between the neighborhood and broader community and the demolition and redevelopment of the courts? And we can start with Teri.
Yeah, John covered it pretty well. Essentially, what we're seeing is a land grab. The west side of San Antonio has experienced decades of economic disinvestment, and now we're experiencing a lot of investment, right? However, it's concentrated on beautification projects and the development of multifamily housing units, all of which is inaccessible to the existing constituency of the west side because it drastically exceeds our average area median income. So what we're seeing is the destabilization of our neighborhoods through predatory practices. Like, we've seen how the real estate industry was using SAHA's data on who has had their water turned off to inquire about buying their homes. We've seen how folks in the real estate industry have made predatory code compliance calls to justify the demolition of homes. We're seeing folks show interest in buying homes near the Alazán Courts because it's near these beautification projects that are asking for tours of homes and then reporting them to code compliance because what they're seeing inside the home, and the city is putting it to the Building and Standards Board, who has the authority to demolish a home without council approval. And we need to look at who's being appointed to these boards and what their interests are. For example, in District 5, it's a real estate developer who has the authority to demolish homes, who flips and builds homes within District 5. So we need to be looking into these people who are appointed into these boards. And as John pointed out, right, they're all embedded in the system. So we need to make sure that we're calling them out and their self-interest, because it's our neighborhoods, our communities that are at risk of displacement. And what this is, it's an attack on our most vulnerable. It is class warfare because it's an attack on our most vulnerable. And there's a lot of gaslighting, a lot of willful ignorance when it comes to city leadership and those who are supposed to be, you know, community advocates, and we need to make sure that we're holding them accountable and ensuring that public funds are used for public good. And when the city gets federal funding from HUD or the federal government, that they're used to rehab homes rather than demolish homes.
Thank you, Terry. Christine?
Thanks, Kayla. That question about a new development and the impact on community and neighborhood is really a gentrification question, because the signal of an enormous investment like that one then goes out to the out into the, you know, kind of the larger city and says, okay, we're starting to put, I'm not going to say dump, but we're starting to put resources back into this neighborhood. The policing is going to change. The provision of public goods is going to change. And it really is a signal for investment dollars to start coming back in. And that's in turn, because of the increased demand, is going to start to raise the property taxes. And we're starting to see the same thing around, unfortunately, because we have no protections in place whatsoever. We're starting to see some of the same kind of mechanisms happening around some of the really nice public investments that have been made recently. So along the West Side creeks, for example, that are getting the trails, now property values are starting to go up and people are going to start to be displaced because we have no protections in place whatsoever in this kind of free market of real estate. Let me just talk just for like 30 seconds to this idea of context and narratives and stories. Is that yeah, I am an academic, but I do think that there's a really serious role for I don't know, for people like myself, for others that are thinking about this and don't have some of the personal experience, and I'll admit that. The fundamental process at work right now is about profit accumulation. We know that, right? Real estate is profit accumulation. But nobody's going to come out and say, well, I'm all about profit accumulation. So it has to be couched somehow. The whole story has to be couched in some kind, in a discourse. And right now the discourse is isolated poverty and mixed income. And I think for some of us, and actually Robert brought up the old one, is that Alazan was built for public health reasons, and now it's being demolished partly for public health reasons. How often do we see, well, these dense neighborhoods are where COVID's really taken off? Well, we have intense density in high-rise condominiums that are $2,000 a month, and you don't see COVID taken off. So it's kind of trying to expose some of the hypocrisies and the ironies in the context that's built around the reasons for profit accumulation, that I think is also a really valuable contribution. And that's what, again, when I think about, we're building we're taking down public housing, saying that isolated poverty is the problem. Well, let's expose that. And let's say, offering mixed income for social mobility is not working. It was just a story to kind of hide what's really going on in terms of profit accumulation. So thanks.
Thank you, Christine. Robert, would you like to answer that?
Sure. Thank you, Kayla. So, look, they promised to replace all of the units at Victoria Courts with the equal number of public housing units. 20 years later, SAHA still says they are working on that goal. When they originally sold the city and the community on Alazan and the demolition, they said that they would replace all of the 500 units. Over time, they continue to reduce that number. Right now, they have committed to 65 units, I believe, in their first phase, and they won't disclose any more numbers. You know, one of the things to kind of look at is what happened after Victoria Courts. Well, they kicked out the surrounding port community in Lavaca. They've created what's called Southtown right now, which is a very expensive, newer part of town, a part of town that the city is very proud of because it's not the poor communities. This is about the disappearance of the poor. You know, SAHA has said that they're going to demolish Casiano, Apache, Lincoln Courts next. So it was never about the aging condition of Alazan. It's about destroying that entire community. And you're seeing that, you know, it's already been mentioned, code violations, condemnations are increasing, property taxes are squeezing out these long-term homeowners out of their homes, these really unethical speculators that are not at all being policed or descending like vultures on these families, and there's trying to swindle families out of their properties during an economic crisis. And so I'm sure the city would love to create a West Town, right? Or some other dumb name that's going to appeal to the gentrifiers. And I am sure the city would love to convert San Antonio into the next Austin, because isn't that a great thing to talk about? But poor people can't live in Austin. And they are building slums 30 minutes away from Austin, 1 hour away, you know, that are crime ridden, that have substandard housing, no public housing. And so this idea that they want mixed income and they want poor people to live among richer people, like that was never really the intent. And in my work as a tenants attorney, I've seen unethical landlords where there's a vacuum of public housing. And I've seen them take advantage of the poor. There is one landlord in particular that I'll always remember. He called himself the slumlord millionaire. He actually wanted to do a reality TV show featuring himself with that name. And basically what his like MO really was to rent out these unlivable homes and then steal a poor person's first month's rent and security deposit. When they figured out they couldn't live in the home, they would lose that money, and then he would re-rent a week, 2 weeks later to another poor family. And you know, some of these tenants, I remember families with children, they tried living in those places because without electricity, without heat, with water gushing from the ceiling, with bed bug and vermin infestations, because they had nowhere else to go. And this is the future of San Antonio under SAHA's current plan. As John has noted, you know, where these people see dollar signs, we see human lives. We are going to lose human lives if the housing authority in the city of San Antonio gets its way, and we already have due to the system's failure to provide health care. We don't know how many lives, right? But the West Side, this community has been ravaged by COVID-19. And the housing authority's plans will make all of this worse. They're going to shift the people in this community to fragmented, crime-ridden, unsafe areas. They're going to shuttle even more community members into the prison industrial complex because that is their model. They're not just demolishing 501 homes. I wish it were that simple. I mean, that is awful, right? But they're also demolishing an entire community. This is what it's about. And we all have to take action now because the alternative is much too painful.
Thank you, Robert. I would just like to add to that, you know, I've spoken to several people in the community. I've gone door knocking, and the small business owners, these low income homeowners, they will be affected by this as well. Their property taxes are going to go up. They may or may not be able to pay that. The rents on the small businesses are going to go up. They're going to want a different look because with these brand new apartments, they're going to want, you know, Starbucks instead of the local bakery. They're going to want a QT instead of, the small little Valero we have over here in Trinity. That's the way that it starts, is just with these apartment buildings. And then these small homeowners are not going to be able to afford it. They're going to have to sell their homes. And I did speak to one woman that lives 3 houses down from the Apache side, and they're trying to buy her house. She's getting 10 to 15 letters a week. She's getting people knocking on her door, people driving by taking pictures, trying to buy her house. And she used to be an Alazan resident. She worked her entire life, and she got into the Habitat for Humanity program. She paid off her house, and she was so proud of herself for all of her hard work. And now she has to deal with this harassment, and she has to deal with the rising property taxes. They've already started. Even before the demolition has even begun, property taxes have been steadily rising every year. And this is going to keep happening. So these small families, the people that live in this community right now, in 10 years will not be able to afford to live here. So why people are saying, oh, we're bringing money into the community. Yes, you're bringing money into the community and you're kicking out the people that live here now. All these renovations, all these upgrades, all this influx of money is not meant for the current residents here now. It is meant for the type of residents that they want to attract to the neighborhood once these newer buildings are built. So I'm going to move on to the next question. What should the role of public entities such as the Housing Authority and city government be during the pandemic towards public housing residents and tenants in general? I'm going to start with Antonia.
Yes, thank you. So obviously, city government and SAHA should establish policies that will protect the current residents and future residents of public housing. And the residents, as has already been stated, are among the most vulnerable members of our communities: the elderly, the infirm, differently abled, women and children. So that public entities should ensure that tenants are able to stay in their residence without fear of eviction, especially because in most cases, these residents are essential workers and are at high risk of infection in this pandemic. Most of the residents of Alazán Apache Courts are women, women-headed households with children, and they are low-wage earners in a low-wage city. Moreover, women's earnings are about 79% of those of men. So having enough for the bare necessities is extremely difficult, if not impossible. So these realities obviously need to be taken into account by the city and SAHA's public housing and rental policies, and so to ensure that residents are protected. Now, I want to go back very briefly to Robert's, one of his statements, and Kayla's, about the fact that the residents are fearful precisely because of the retaliation that they have experienced. And so my concern then is, how do we protect? We want residents to speak out. We want to hear their stories. We want to get their stories out in the world, in the public. We want to expose the range of issues, but at this point, I don't see that that there is any protection for those residents whom we so much want to speak out. So let me pass it on. Thank you.
Thank you. You're so right. I have gotten, a few residents to start speaking out out of the list of residents that I have spoken to, and through my door knocking, and all during the pandemic, I was out delivering food boxes and school supplies, feminine products, things that were donated to the residents. And I had so many conversations. And the biggest thing is, this is their last step. This is our last step. We have nowhere else to go. So if we lose the place that we have, it is it's homelessness. So I have all of these residents that are anonymous, and they want to remain anonymous because they're too scared of the retaliation. And we are working on a way to get their stories out without revealing their identities. And that's something that you guys can look forward to in the future. But every time I do get a resident to say, okay, you know what, I trust you, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna step up, they do, and then a few weeks later, a month later, they stop because it's too much. It's too hard for them. They're getting too much flack from it. They're getting too much trouble in their homes, and they stop. And this is a huge issue because the city's role, the SAHA's role, should be to protect these individuals. It should be when anyone goes up to speak to them about something, there should be compassion and understanding. It should not be, well, it's your fault, or that's wrong, or you're wrong, or some way of twisting it to make them feel not only wrong, they feel stupid, they feel attacked. And that's not how a person should feel when they're going to talk to the property manager, especially when it is public housing or Section 8 or low income housing. These people are already vulnerable, and then you're going to attack them and make them run away because they're scared. And that is just wrong. Too many times, it's the tenant's word against SAHA's word, the SAHA staff, the maintenance men, whoever it is that they're contradicting. And 95% of the time, when you go to a city official, when you go to an elected official, you tell them your story. They'll say they're going to look into it. And when they say they're going to look into it, they contact SAHA. SAHA says, oh no, they're wrong. And they just accept that. And it stops there. And that is an issue. When I got a copy of my file, I was shocked. I was absolutely shocked at all of the nonsense that was in my file. I can only imagine what is in everyone else's. It is the city's job to manage SAHA. It is SAHA's job to manage the HUD funds that come to the city of San Antonio. It is SAHA's job to maintain properly the properties that they have. And they failed to do that in the last 6 years. In 2016, when David Nichivosa took over as CEO, there was one failing property in all of San Antonio. This is the physical HUD inspection where a third-party HUD inspector goes and inspects a unit. One failing property in San Antonio. 2020, on David's exit, there are 13 failing properties, with 3 more 1 point away from failing. 3 of those properties are the brand new apartments. They're 6 years old. The Gardens at San Juan, the San Juan, and the San Juan 1, and the San Juan 2. Those were built 6 years ago. These are these mixed income properties that SAHA claims are going to save everybody. 6 years, they're already failing their inspections. So is this the promise for the residents? You want to tear down the apartments that have stood for 80 years and are still, the bones are good, they just need renovations? You want to move them to a property that can't last 6 years? That is not an answer. It is their responsibility to protect the vulnerable, not exploit them. Teri, would you like to answer this question?
Yeah, despite community input, the City of San Antonio passed a workforce development program. And with the passage of that, San Antonio and the San Antonio Housing Authority have an opportunity to lead in decarbonizing and retrofitting public housing. There's an opportunity to train folks for green union jobs and using public funds for public good to retrofit public housing. The training and producing green union jobs will not only improve the quality of life, but also local air quality. And it's important that we let folks know that it is possible to upgrade and equip all public housing with cutting edge materials, infrastructure, and and improve the material living standards of the existing public housing units. And I would also add that there's an ongoing discussion on a proposed renters commission. This renters commission would allow renters an opportunity to city council on possible public policy that would impact renters. So that space would be important and would offer protections for tenants to discuss their needs and issues without fear of retaliation, because the retaliation component is very real. As Kayla's mentioned, going door to door, folks, I spoke to community members who are telling you that their heater hasn't worked. They're using, the stove to heat the house. And when you ask like, okay, like, should we put in a maintenance request? It's like, no, they don't want any issue with the San Antonio Housing Authority. There's fear that, requesting that they have something like the oven fixed will somehow turn into a whole other issue. And it's important that, folks don't fear having a heater in their house. I'll turn that to Kayla.
John, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just quickly wanted to say that I think that we should stop asking this question about what people should do. We should start really thinking clearly about what they have done and how we can use that information to predict what they will do, and thinking about everybody who has to get elected to office derives some of their political power from people, right? From organizations, from institutions, and really understanding the decision makers. Where do they get their power? What is their agenda, and how to get in the way of it? And I always use this metaphor. Politicians and capitalists in general are narcissists. I think the best way to think about how to deal with a narcissist is if you ever negotiated with a child, right? Someone who is just entirely obsessed with their own way of looking at the world and literally incapable of being concerned in some ways with what other people are doing. You never tell a child what they should do, right? If you actually want to get a kid to do something, should might work. But usually what works is consequences, is threats, is understanding that look, do you want what you want? Well, you have to do what I want. And if you don't do what I want, I'm going to get in the way of what you want. And so in terms of the way that we frame and think about negotiating with power, these are narcissist gaslighters, right? So they have the minds of children, but they will use our language. And anybody who's ever been in a bad relationship knows all about this dynamic where someone keeps telling you they're going to get better. Oh, we'll figure it out. We'll fix it. And at some point you come to this recognition that this person is never going to get better. They're never going to do the things that they say they're going to do. And I either have to separate myself from the situation or get crystal clear about what I'm demanding from them and what kind of consequences I create. So I think it's a great question for this panel, but I think when we're doing strategy, you should never have should and elected official or power player in the same sentence, because if you ask them what they should do, they will tell you exactly what you want to hear over and over and over again until you make the decision to start treating them differently.
Thank you, John. We have one final question before we move on to the Q&A. What has been the effect of federal housing policy historically on inner San Antonio? What is the role of federal housing policies been on the poor nationally? And can we start with John, please?
Sure, I'll try to be quick because I've been taking up a lot of space. The role has been whenever the private market, whenever big corporations need places for people to live where they're going to build big projects, the federal government comes in and builds usually segregated, whether explicitly or implicitly segregated housing around those areas. And historically, for poor people of color, it has been a trap. It has been a way to concentrate poverty. And I think it's important people note that HUD was started in 1968. By 1982, the political decision was made to defund it, really, to slowly defund and undermine the funding mechanisms, and actually affordable housing and the low-income housing tax credits actually take away from the pool of money that is used to fund public housing. And so really what they did is they sold communities on this idea of community development of an affordable housing, which has limits of 15, 20, 25, or 30 years, and really said, hey, people should get affordable housing, not public housing. And they defunded public housing. So the impact of all of this public policy has been segregation, gentrification, further undermining of the social infrastructure of poor communities. And I think that's what our job is at the Homes Guarantee, is to actually push federal policy back to what it was from 1968 to the late 80s, where public housing was being built and was being invested in fully. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, John. Antonia?
So talking about the historical significance of public housing, and specifically the Alazán Apache Courts in this case, is that these buildings and the people in them and the communities that they have built represent the vital legacy and heritage of public housing locally and nationally. So in 2020, the National Trust for Historic Preservation acknowledged the historical importance by naming the Alazán Apache Courts among the 11 most endangered places in the United States, and therefore recognized their historical importance, not just to San Antonio, not just to the state of Texas, but nationally, meaning that they should be saved. The courts are a central part of the working class history and culture of the West Side, and therefore of San Antonio, a story that the WPA and the Esperanza began to recover in the exhibit Los Courts, which we saw earlier in the exhibit was in 2018 in the Alazán Apache Courts headquarters. This historic place and this the history of its people cannot be replaced when these buildings are demolished. So let us continue to struggle and to fight for rehabilitation of the Alazán Apache Courts. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Drennon?
Yeah, thanks, Kayla. Just really briefly, is thinking about the history of public housing and how significant it was. And one thing I just want to make really clear is that public housing, the rents in traditional public housing were a function of how much money a household made. As we've transitioned into this public-private partnership model based on mixed income and tax credits, rents now are a function of the median income in the entire metropolitan statistical area. The median income in the San Antonio statistical area is going up rapidly, and it's going up because of in-migration. It's not going up because our wages are going up. Our wages are fairly stagnant, if not going down. So that the median income of our area has gone up significantly in the last couple of years, meaning that rents that are pegged to the median income are also going up. So someone's wage may be stagnant, but their wage is going up because a lot of people are moving into our area, versus the old public housing model, which was your rent was a product of how much you as a household made. That's a huge difference. So if we hear this story that no, this is a one-for-one replacement, that public housing is being replaced by what are called 30% or 60% tax credit units, the calculation of the rent is significantly different. So it's one of these, it's a narrative that's put together that sounds good when we hear it, but we have to educate ourselves and get smart enough to respond and to be able to use some of that argument plus others. We have to be even smarter in order to respond and kind of expose some of what's going on here that I might call hypocrisy. Thanks.
Thank you. Did any of the other panelists want to answer this question? No?
Kayla, Antonia, I just want to say, which I failed to say in my brief comments earlier, is that the loss of Alazán Apache Courts is violence. It is a form of violence because it is erasure. And so therefore, the history of this community and of its people gets erased as if we didn't exist, as if those people didn't exist. So I cannot stress strongly enough the importance of working towards rehabbing Alazán Apache courts and not destroying it, because otherwise we lose that history of that community and its people as if we didn't exist. And that goes back to John's points about power and what happens with it. Thanks.
Thank you. We will go ahead and get to questions that were posted in the chat. Let's see. Sorry. Does SAHA have a list where current residents will be displaced? Is there a community that will be receiving displaced residents aware? Is that community aware? How does the displacement affect school enrollment for children? And are the schools and districts ready for the increased enrollment? And how will the new development affect current home appraisals of the local community? That was all put into like one question. So I will open it up for you guys to answer. Who wants to go first? Teri?
Sure, can you restate the question? I'm trying to find it in the chat.
Does SAHA have a plan for where the residents are going?
Yeah, no, the San Antonio Housing Authority has not presented a plan to community, despite community showing up to citizens to be heard in large numbers, asking and demanding that a plan be presented to community. One has not been provided. The argument that board members of the San Antonio Authority use is that residents will be given choice vouchers, but as Roberts pointed out, there's a shortage of landlords who accept vouchers. And landlords have the option to say no and to not accept vouchers. So no, there's no plan that the San Antonio Housing Authority has presented or made public of where residents are going to be relocated to.
I just want to say that, I think that, again, marginalized people are marginalized because of systems. Vulnerable people are vulnerable because the system was designed to make them vulnerable. So they want an overloaded school system. They want people displaced and unable to bring their lives together and to build power and organize and have dignity. So, the property values are going to rise. Small businesses will definitely be some of the first to go. And it does have a terrible effect on children that we definitely need to bring more into the conversation. And I have a question. I'm interested in the child homelessness rate in San Antonio public schools. I think that's one barometer that is really important to talk about in your language, and also to try to attach to public policy to say, if our homelessness rate reaches this trigger point, we need to put more resources into housing, and to try to leverage through bonds and other tactics the school boards resources, because public school districts have enormous budgets that maybe they don't have money to spend, but they can be leveraged against to invest in housing. And there's a few communities that are starting to do that.
Okay, thank you. There are several questions. We might not be able to get to all of them, but I do want to let you know that if we don't answer your question on the video, we will go back and answer it in the chat. Another question is there a count or tally on how many Alazán Apache current residents are against demolishing? And have they said, again, the plan for replacement? I'm going to answer this quickly. I have lists of residents who want to remain anonymous, so they won't come out publicly to speak, but I'm working on a solution to that to where they can remain anonymous but still speak. Because a large number of the residents and the community are against the demolition when you give them all the facts, when you let them know demolition is not set in stone. It is in the beginning stages. They haven't put in the application yet, and you can still stop this. Now, when you give them different information, saying, okay, well, it's already a done deal and you have a choice to do this or this, then they're going to go with the best solution to their situation, which is they don't want to be homeless. So giving them an open conversation and giving them all the facts that the communities that are listed on the SAHA PowerPoint that was presented to the commission, the majority of those properties are mixed income properties, and in these mixed income properties, about 10% of the units are available for public housing residents. And the fact that there are different qualifications and guidelines in order to get these units, and the fact that there are 3 to 5 year wait lists on a lot of these properties. We personally called all the properties listed, and they're full. They're full up. So they're stating a plan that they hope works, but it's not a concrete plan, and that's not good enough for the resident. It's flawed on so many levels. I will go on to another question. If anyone has any other questions on that, we can answer in the chat.
Just real quick, Kayla, I do have to jump off in a few, but I wanted to answer one of the questions in the chat.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So that question is, how does the displacement affect school enrollment for children? And are the school districts ready for the increase in enrollment? And so one of the things here, as we've talked about, is we don't know where these residents will be going. No one does, right? I mean, it's going to be basically wherever they can find a Section 8 voucher accepting landlord. And I imagine it's going to be some of the poorer communities in town. So maybe, Edgewood, maybe they'll stay in San Antonio ISD, maybe they'll have to, go outside of the loop. And I think a lot of families may, because there's more availability there. So what I want to say on this one is, it's both kind of thinking about how it's going to affect the receiving school district, but also the outgoing. So San Antonio Independent School District historically has been a school district that struggles. I am a product of San Antonio Independent School District, but it has always had some level of challenges, now more than ever. And part of the reason why is because during the Trump administration, there was a huge push for charter schools. So we've had all of these charter schools spring up. Some of them are wonderful institutions, but there's a lot of them that are terrible. But they've sprung up and they've stolen or taken some of San Antonio Independent School District's students. And so when that happens, the enrollment goes down and the Texas Education Agency funds them less. So this is already a school district that was struggling because school districts in Texas are funded by property tax dollars, and because it is a poorer area, there's less of that money. But now with the COVID-19 pandemic, San Antonio Independent School District has also lost track of specific students. I don't know their numbers, but I can tell you Northeast ISD, for example, they've currently lost more than 3,000 students. When I say lost, they don't know where these students are. And these students are likely not getting education. So it's going to become a huge social dilemma. And this school district that's already not doing well, not providing enough services to their students, they're going to have even less money to do so. And San Antonio Independent School District, they will not tell you this, right? Because they don't want to alarm parents and employees. But this is kind of the reality that they are facing currently, and without any further support from the state, which has been really reluctant to support them during the COVID-19 pandemic, or from the Biden administration, which, you know, I have hopes that Biden will meet some of these needs, but there's still a ton of uncertainty. We are going to have some significant issues, both in terms of housing, but also educationally in this area.
Thank you, Robert. I don't want to, we're already 8 minutes past. I don't want to keep everyone too long. Is there any specific questions in the chat that any of you want to reply to?
Just real quick, I just want to say there's a lot of questions about who's been reached out to. And I just want to say, like, this is really about us building power, and it's good to reach out to and talk to the people who frankly are in this war against us. But I would say that it's more important that those meetings happen when power has been built and when there is a really powerful community to meet with those groups. So I know that there's a whole lot of questions about reaching out to different people and identifying different people and making connections, but those connections have to be of equal power, or they're going to be abusive, you know. So I just wanted to address that real quick. And again, thank you so much for doing this and having me here.
So were there any other comments or replies to questions from any of the other panelists?
Yeah, just really briefly, some of the last really big redevelopment that SAHA did was the Wheatley Courts that transitioned into East Meadows. And the first phase of when residents moved out, an enormous percentage of residents, they moved out into unfavorable situations, into neighborhoods that had higher crime rates and poorer performing schools than the ones that they'd come from. And then they ended up moving several more times, which was painful for children and really hard on families. So there was, you know, as far as being prepared, especially in this environment for what comes next, we don't have a great track record. So some of the questions were about where people will go, and the inventory of housing right now that accepts housing vouchers is pretty slim and in pretty unfavorable situations. And there's actually not a lot in the area of Alazán Apache, so that those kids won't be able to stay in the same schools. So that whole movement phase is incredibly problematic, and nobody's prepared for it.
Yeah, I just want to add on to your statement, Dr. Drennon, that, you know, there's a lot of promises being made. You know, residents, they're hearing, okay, they're going to get a $1,200 flat rate check to move out. Well, I mean, I don't know about anybody else, but $1,200 is nothing. You have your final bills at your apartment, you have the cost of moving, the cost of new deposits at the new place, and then if you do take a Section 8 voucher, it's not the $200 public housing deposit, it's a full deposit. And then you don't know if there's a risk deposit as well that's non-refundable, because they run your credit, they run your background, and they can even turn you down as a Section 8 landlord, where public housing would not turn you down. There are higher qualifications and more loopholes to jump through to have a Section 8 voucher. And then again, most times it's a worse neighborhood than you come from. So that $1,200 is really nothing. And then when they give us the list of the apartments that they're saying are going to be available, if you go back and listen to the SAHA board recording, they'll tell you, they'll list Tampico Lofts, they'll say 200 units. Yes, Tampico Lofts is 200 units, but only 9 units are available for public housing residents. So 501 families, and you're also offering us, you know, 9 units at, 6 or 7 different properties. Where are the rest going? And then they keep promising that 100% return rate, that everyone will be able to return if they want to. Well, if they're tearing down 501 units and building up, 368 units, and only 66 of those units are set aside for, public housing income level residents, because it's not going to be public housing, it's going to be a 30% AMI. But those 66 units, 501, the math does not add up. The numbers don't add up. It's a pretty picture that's being painted, but it's a false picture. And I would just suggest that anyone who is new to this, who doesn't understand, or even people in the community who want to understand, really just do your own research. Go on all of the presentations. Everything is available either online or through a public information request, and do the research yourself before you make a decision. Everyone has a right to their own opinion, but when things are skewed to the favor of the person doing the presenting, then that is a huge problem, especially for low-income individuals who don't have access to the data and the research and the time to do so. So it's imperative that residents be educated and informed and speak for themselves. So I want to thank all of the panelists for coming today. I appreciate your time. I appreciate you guys staying 15 minutes over. We will be sending out the questions from the chat and giving people the opportunity to answer those, and then we'll post them on social media later on. That way everybody's questions do get answered. I want to thank Esperanza Peace and Justice Center for hosting this for us and helping us get all this together, because this is a conversation that needs to happen, and it's a conversation that needs to continue to happen. Also, I want to let everyone know that you guys can go to Esperanza's Facebook page. You can also go to the Coalition for Tenant Justice, Historic Westside Resident Association, and Texas Housers pages for more information on what's going on in the community. Thank you very much and have a great day. You can go to YouTube, Esperanza YouTube, and you can watch the video. Thank you.
And it'll also be on Facebook too after this.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Kayla.
Thank you, Kayla.
Thank you. I'm going to stop. Okay, right at the